Hello everybody, welcome to the Wizard's Den. I'd like to do this little short video. I'm going to try to make it kind of short. And I'd like to talk about the nature of atheism and spirituality, and how spirituality and atheism essentially wind up kind of coexisting in the adept's mind, and how it becomes a reality that, there is no God in the sense that religious people think of it. When you really begin to get to higher levels of attainment and understand the deeper natures of these philosophies, the idea of where the source of morality comes from, things like this, which we talk about the Euthyphro dilemma, which is, if God says something is something good because God says it's good, or is something good because it's God's just the messenger. In other words, is God say something is good because it's already good? And this is a philosophic dilemma that goes back to Socrates and Platonic dialogue. Point being is that we realize that God's not really the source of morality. And that our true nature of understanding the divine is quite limited. If we want to call it the divine or God or whatever. And that it's kind of like Epicurus, and people like that, philosophers said a long time ago that, it doesn't seem like the gods are really that concerned with human affairs, it doesn't seem like they really intervene. And that we're just to kind of live our lives and try to have a good life, eudaimonia in Greek, and to attain ataraxia, which is, tranquility, peace, and to pass from this life in peace. And so a lot of people don't understand how a person can equate atheism, or say, how do I understand the afterlife? In other words, what do I believe in? And it's a little bit complicated, and it gets kind of into some theoretical things, and also kind of thinking things about it on a more kind of scientific level, or biological level, how it would actually work at the point of death and things like this. And believe it or not, the ancient books of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and things like this have studied. That's what the ancient monks did. They studied people in their state of dying. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead has a considerable amount to offer our understanding of what happens as we approach the point of death. But in other words, no. Eventually, you will come to this conclusion that you're either going to be a nihilist, or some kind of absurdist, basically an atheist that does not believe that there's any meaning, and there's no God, and there's no devil. Obviously, if there's no God, there's no devil. All of that's inner alchemy. All that's inner. It's the devil doesn't actually exist other than in your own divided consciousness. The devil doesn't exist in the mind of the animal. They don't know what evil is. They didn't eat the fruit, according to myth, so, there's all these problems that approach with theism, and we approach all these philosophic problems, and so eventually, without going into a lot more gross detail as how we arrive there, your higher attained mystic, the person who is at the highest level, who you assume must be this most godly person, right, has actually let go of that idea. And that God becomes more of something that's an experiential thing, how you experience it. God becomes more impersonal. The personal God is really where you come with the divine incarnation doctrine, where you have a human being and a personality. And so that's where you get a personal deity, the idea that there's a deity with a personality. So it gets really kind of deep in things, but what I'm trying to say is that people ask me, because I kind of carry myself as this modern day kind of mystic and wizard that knows a lot about ancient, mythology and religion and the ancient mindset of these ideas and where they come from. And so you say, well, are you just abandoning? In other words, where is the middle ground between agnostic atheism and theism and also living in a lifestyle of a spirit of a type of quote unquote spirituality? What is spirituality? So I found this very interesting because I saw this debate between this atheist and I think it was Dr. Craig. It was another theist that was arguing between the nature of spirit. And the atheist, poses the question to the theist and says, well, what's the nature of spirit? What is a spirit? And he's like, well, it's a non-being. And, well, you can't just describe what it isn't. You have to describe what it is. And it surprised me that the theist didn't come to this conclusion, because an occultist would understand this immediately. They understand the difference between the psyche or the soul and the spirit. It's not the same thing. They're not the same thing, okay? They can be conflated very, very quickly, just like faith and belief, but that's a whole other... those two things get conflated all the time, okay? What I'm trying to say is that the spirit is that which influences, animates, and inspires life. It's not necessarily, you can think of it like an egregore, a collective thought entity that, becomes its own spiritual, being or existing, but it's not really a being of what we think of being, The spirit is this kind of, really very, impersonal thing that's not only becomes personal when it influences life, okay, when it animates the life. So it or influences or inspires that which is conscious. So the spirit is a very, very, it's hard to understand what the nature of what spirit is. And then because the doctrines of Christianity say, well, they equate this with God, like in the Trinity doctrine, which I'm not going to try to break all that down and explain that. There is a logical explanation of how to understand the Trinity doctrine that goes back to Egypt and all this stuff, but I'm not going to get into all that. What I'm trying to say is that the nature of spirit is that which animates or influences, inspires life. It's everywhere around us. In every movie you watch, every book you read, every person you listen to that talks, there's a spiritual force moving through them that is influencing them or inspiring them to speak the way they are speaking. Now, what's the nature of that spirit? Okay, it can be anything from the most Holy Spirit, the most thing that brings you closer to the transcendent. We say closer to God, or closer to the more divine, transcendent, the higher soul, as they say, the neshama in Kabbalah, to connect that together and become more awakened, okay? There's a spirit that brings us closer to there through knowledge, through studying spiritual and, studying the wisdoms and studying the natures of spiritual doctrines and principles. And so we come to know this in a way that is not like the average person thinks about spirits and things like that. So we are a collective kind of entity that says, well, I am both a spirit and my soul is just the cup that collects the spiritual force, you know what I mean? And then reflects that back as a personality, okay? So we are all influenced by different spiritual forces, everything from the most, from the most wicked and evil and things that are harmful and very, that separate us from this part of ourselves that is transcendent, that creates suffering, that binds us. And then there's a spiritual power that frees us, that allows us to become awakened and free thinkers, and we're not fettered to dogmas, and we're, so what's that spirit? Well, a lot of times people equate that with Lucifer, the Luciferian spirit, and it is in a certain psychological way, in a certain spiritual sense, and mythical sense. There's the problem most people are trying to do all the time. They try to fact check the myth. If you try to fact check the myth and try to be like, well, who was Lucifer? No, these things are principles. They represent ideas and principles. It's not something that happened in linear time and a long time ago or something like that. That's the first thing you understand in Kabbalah, is that Genesis and Revelation is an ongoing thing. Involution and evolution. It's an ongoing process. Calvary is an ever becoming moment. We understand it spiritually in this sense. We don't think of it as just this finite event in time, and back then was creation, and then eventually the end of the world will come. We see it as the Ouroboros. We see it as the cycles of cosmic energy and time, and the cycles of the eons, and know that it's all connected in that way. So, to say something briefly, I will say this, because I want to make this to less than 15 minutes, is that back to dying and death, which is the heaviest thing most people can talk about and think about, is that what I believe is that, yes, you will have a moment, just like it says Kabbalah, to where you will review your life as you're dying. In that moment of death, whether it be even in an instant moment that you get smashed and you're almost like you think, well, they instantly died, but there's going to be this moment that time and space ceases to exist. And in that flash of moment, or in that process over a period of time, however death happens to you, you will experience this experience. You'll have an experience, just like you do in dreams. And your dream state often is a reflection of the soul. It often gives you an idea of where your fears and inner fears and subconscious mind is at, if you can remember your dreams. So often, mystics will, and people will say that are into these kind of Jungian ideas of spirituality, and Carl Jung, which is, was a great analytical psychologist. So I'm assuming you know who Carl Jung is, but without going into all that, these Jungian ideas that that spirituality is something that is innate to a human being. We need it, but we create all these religions and gods and all these things that, in other words, it's obvious to the atheists that men create gods. Human beings create gods. And so where do we come in the middle, and how do we understand how to connect to a part of ourselves that is this desire to attain to a higher transcendent place of awareness and being, so that you can become realized and become the potential of the human potential you have, and that is what religion is really about. It's linking us back. Religio, it means linking back. And it links us back to the ancestors. That was the first religion, was the worship of ancestors, because the ancestors is what links us to the other world, and we link them to the world of the living world. So together we create this link, okay? And because they are literally the ancestors, they are our our heritage. We are the offspring of them. So we carry a part of their DNA. Science talks about this, how even animals can, we atavistic memories, and we literally, we in the DNA, it becomes part of our being. And so I won't delve into all that biology and all that psychology, but what I'm trying to say is this is a very real thing, and that spirituality is connected to this. So what I'm trying to say is, at the moment of death, we think of it as being like, okay, you die, and then past this is like, here's the afterlife, but we don't think of it as being that, well, in that very moment, that time and space basically ceases to exist in the mind, much like in dreams, where time and space is very fleeting and immutable. And, what seems like a minute could be, days in your dreams, or whatever, and you seem like days, what might just be, Yeah, you see this all the time in mythology where they depict this, that the other world does not, does not behave, or does not have anything to do with our time and space and dimension. It's in another space and dimension that does not abide by our time and space. So in that saying that there is a place when the moment of death occurs, that dimension of reality will occur, and that the state of the soul or the psyche and the spiritual influences which it has embodied and has nurtured in its life, and has, basically the things, is the spirit of truth? Is it greed? What is it? Is it something that's more grounded in selfishness and sinfulness? Is it helping the world? Are you speaking the truth no matter what, whether you are condemned for it or not? What spirit indwells you that in a way that seems like you cannot escape this, it seems like it's a part of you, that you can't, once it becomes, you become a vessel or a channel for the spirit, okay, that it seems to be something that almost, overcomes you, and in a powerful way, depending on the nature of the spirit, okay. And so especially people like me that in certain, types of scholars and wizardly types, we prize truth as our highest value. So we are willing to accept very difficult things that would say, well, yeah, you're essentially worm food. If you want to look at it. What I'm trying to say is both the atheists, both are correct. There is this point of eternity and the vacuum and the still point at death. And there is the fin in our world would say, well, yeah, you're in the ground. You're worm food. Okay. So in essence, this is my smoking, here's the very end of it. When it says in religion that God is preparing a place for you, think about that in a very profound way. That God is preparing a place. That place is being prepared is your life that you're living. and God is preparing the place for you at the end of your life, what that moment consists of. And I won't get into all that. I mean, it's like trying to find the physical coordinates to a dream. So to try to kind of objectify that and try to create, what is all that and heaven and hell, all I'm trying to say is it's subjective. It is something that's within us. We experience it in everyday life, and we will experience it also at the end of life. And so not only is the Gospel of Luke says that the kingdom of heaven is within us or is amongst us, but that we will carry and as we live our lives, God is preparing that place for us to where we will wind up at the end of our lives. And it will be a mirror of our lives. And I think that in that moment there's a quintessential spark within each of us and Kabbalah talks about when you relive your moments of your life, you begin to replay it, that you might even experience the pains and the things you've given other people, and you feel this. It's almost like you're in this place of where things are really connected, and you realize how connected you are to everything and everybody and and that in this state of between state in your psyche, that you will actually, you will experience either heaven or you will experience hell, or you'll experience something in between. And that will be the threshold through which you cross and then find that place for which you to rest, for which the soul needs to rest. Because death we don't want to live forever. Nothing should live forever. The idea that the ego will live forever, that's a curse. The idea that religion tries to sell this to you, well, believe in Jesus, and you'll have eternal life, What, so I can live in my ego? So either heaven has to be something that's beyond, that is transcendent to all, past, present, and idea of good and evil. But then how would I know that I'm in heaven if I no longer understand the difference between good and evil and pain and bliss? So there's a lot of philosophical problems with that. And what I would say is that, yes, the atheist is correct. We're worm food. But the religionist is also, the person who says that there is some kind of judgment, there is something there at the end of life, is also true. And that the Lord is preparing a place for us for when we are at the end of this consciousness, when the reflective side of this universe with that is reflecting within your own subjective lens as a personality, that fragment is absorbed and becomes part of the whole again. And you can think of that how you wish. You can say, whatever, it's the river going as Khalil Gibran said, it's like the river approaching the ocean. It fears to approach it, but it realizes that that's the source of where it came from. So we shouldn't fear death, really, because there's no eternal torment. But there is some kind of cosmic justice. We need to fear the idea of living a good life or a bad life, and that there will be some consequence at the end of our life, that somehow there's cosmic justice that kind of does let us either pass from this life peacefully or with fear and trembling, with what is the gnashing of teeth, as the Bible says. From the Wizard's Den, love you all.